everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be discussing kinks and fetishes. Now I have already filmed this entire video once. I got a little bit into editing it, and it turns out that partway through my mic just dies. I have this weird microphone where it records a left and a right hand side. And like the right side just decided it wasn't gonna record audio anymore for part of the video. And so here we are, we're trying it again because this is an important subject, especially because I just did a video where I referenced this. So I did a BDSM 101 video where I talked about medical play. And I had a little segment in there where I was like, medical play is a fetish for some people. It is a sexual thing for some people. I don't have time right now to discuss exactly what a fetish is. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, here is another video you can watch where I go over exactly what that means. And as it would turn out, I had a patron who had just watched that very video when I made that one on medical play. And they messaged me and they were like, hey, I just watched this video you did about fetishes and kinks, and I was wondering why you didn't talk about this one really big area of kinks, and I was wondering if there was a reason why you didn't mention it. And I was like, oh, that's weird. I don't know why I wouldn't talk about that. And I rewatched it and then I was like, oh, this is not what I remember. 2016 Evie did not have a comprehensive view of this subject. This is much too narrow. I need to revisit this ASAP. So I wrote a script for this video that very night, and here we are. I am filming about it today, and we are hopefully going to have a much more detailed conversation, a much more nuanced conversation about what the differences and definitions are of the terms kink and fetish, as well as a few closely related things that you may come across when you are researching these topics for yourself. So I think the reason why this is really important is because in the kink community, these terms very much get used interchangeably, like just colloquially. If you're at a munch, if you're at a play party, people are just going to call things fetishes and kinks, sometimes in sort of a joking manner, to the point where it can be difficult to understand exactly where the differences are between the two. And if you're first exploring BDSM, if you're trying to figure out what your interests are and what they mean to you, it's going to be very confusing to even know what to label things as. Like, is this a kink? Is this a fetish? What do I call this? What do these terms even mean? And so I'm really hoping that by doing this video, I will offer you an opportunity to learn what these things mean to you, and also hopefully create a little bit more concise dialogue, I guess I would say, in the kink community, more precise ways of talking about things, because these things do actually have some set definitions. And that's where I want to start, is actually with the first term, fetish, because the term fetish is quite interesting. It's one of the few terms we have in the BDSM community that actually comes from a medical definition, a medical background. It will vary a little bit depending on what diagnostic manual you are using and what version of that manual you are using. So for example, the DSM-3 TR versus the DSM-5, there will be some differences between those two, but generally speaking, in a medical context, the term fetish refers to a sexual fixation where it is with a non-genital body part or with a non-human object. Some really common fetishes would include clothing, shoes, leather, latex, and feet. And what is interesting is the kink community doesn't really tend to stick to just that medical definition where it is only non-human objects and non-genital body parts. It expands to include more activities and situations. So when I hear the term fetish used in the kink community, that could also include things like, for example, water sports or smoking. And we'll get into what the more medical term would be for those things that the kink community refers to as also being a fetish. And so in the kink community, the way that we see a fetish is not so much the origins of the fixation, the object of the fixation, but the role that it plays in one's sexual response cycle. The way that I would use the term fetish and the way that I see it used in the kink community when it is being used more precisely is it is a way of saying that it is something, an object, a situation that you need to think about or interact with in some way in order to achieve arousal or to achieve climax. As psychologist and sexologist Denise Rain states, a fetish is typically referred to as a behavior that someone cannot get aroused without. And in an even broader definition, you can also think about a fetish as a sexual arousal that is coupled with a typically non-sexual act. And that is the way I think it is more commonly used in the kink community. And for me, I think that's the way that it really makes the most sense because it incorporates a lot of things that are left out of the more typical medical definition that a lot of people would consider to actually be fetishes for them in reality. Now, I want to make a note here for another term that is very closely related to fetish, and that is paraphilias. So the term paraphilia isn't really used in the BDSM world. I can't think of a time when I've ever heard anyone in kink call something a paraphilia before. It seems to be more restricted to just a medical setting. And the way that I would think about a paraphilia is this. So you have a fetish, which medically is restricted to those things which involve non-genital body parts and non-human objects. A paraphilia is like the umbrella term that a fetish would fall under. Some other types of paraphilias would include exhibitionism, voyeurism, masochism, sadism. And the reason why I want to bring this up in particular is because if you are on the internet like I am, and you run into people who are arguing against BDSM, like BDSM is a bad thing, the reason why is because, look, it's in the DSM. That means it's a mental disorder. And if it's a mental disorder, it's a bad thing and a negative, and people, shouldn't have this. They should work through them. Sadism, masochism, blah, 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 blah. It's all bad. It's all a mental illness, and it needs to be fixed, and you people need to stop doing this. And it's not as cut and dry as they seem to think it is, with it just purely always being a mental illness and being a negative thing in someone's life that needs to be cut out. Because actually, in the DSM-5, if you look at it, under paraphilias, they do a really specific job of trying to parse out what is a paraphilia versus a paraphilic disorder. And more or less what they do is they acknowledge that paraphilias exist. They don't necessarily inherently have to be a negative thing or an unhealthy thing in someone's life. The things that make it a paraphilic disorder versus merely having a paraphilia is psychological dependence, having a lot of distress as a result of the paraphilia, and or acting out the paraphilia in harmful ways with non-consenting parties. So if those things aren't happening, then it's not a disorder. Being a masochist is not inherently the same thing as having, sexual masochistic disorder, for example, or all those other terminologies that I use. There is a difference between having a paraphilia and having a paraphilic disorder. It can be a little bit difficult when it comes to the distress marker because with fetishes, with these things, it is oftentimes very misunderstood by the larger society. It can be something that brings the person a lot of embarrassment or guilt or shame, social pressure to cover it up, a very deep level of uncomfortableness when it comes to hiding these things from partners. And so those things can all cause distress, but that's not exactly the same thing as like internal discomfort. Like if there was social acceptance, would the distress still be there, kind of? I mean, I'm not a therapist, I am not a psychologist, I'm not anything, so I don't want to tell anyone how to interpret the DSM's definitions or anything like that, but as an example, that is one way you can think about that, because the distress portion of that criteria can be the most difficult one to sort out, because there is also sort of the larger social pressure that can contribute to one's distress there. So that's what a paraphilia is. That is what a paraphilic disorder is. I just wanted to make a little side note of that because it is something that one will often come across if you are Googling what a fetish is, or if you have people who are arguing that like BDSM is inherently bad and is all mental illness and blah, 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 blah. But moving on, let us talk about exactly what a kink is. Now, defining a kink can be much more difficult because we don't have that medical terminology to fall back on. It is one of those areas where it is very personal, depending on where you live. Different people may define it differently. Every person has their own thoughts about it, but I will try my best to come up with something that is concise and something that I think will work for most people based on consensus. And I think the best way I can think of to define a kink is it is an intimate practice that involves a non-normative fantasy concept, situation, or relationship style. This interest could be sexual in nature, but that is not always the case. You can also have a kink where the interest comes from some sort of emotional pleasure, a mental pleasure, even a non-sexual physical pleasure. A good example of this is my relationship with pet play. So I get a lot of emotional pleasure from engaging in pet play, which is definitely not a conventional vanilla activity. And that's exactly the sort of area that a kink would define that maybe a fetish wouldn't. And I think that is really the main barrier between a kink and a fetish that is really clear and easy to see. A fetish is inherently sexual. It is inherently linked to someone's sexual arousal. And a kink can be sexual, but that is not always the case for everyone's individual kinks. Some other examples of kinks include flogging, spanking, caning, service submission, rope bondage, sensory deprivation, just to name a few. Even if you do have a kink that is sexual for you, that doesn't necessarily always go into fetish territory. So a good example of this is spanking. You may really enjoy over-the-knee spankings. It may be sexually arousing for you, either because the position is literally physically stimulating for you or something mentally about it is stimulating for you that results in sexual pleasure. But it might not be something that you need in order to achieve arousal, and it might not be something that you actively fantasize about. I have also heard the term kink used in different ways. So another way that I see the term kink used in the BDSM community is as a sort of way to describe what your preferred BDSM activities are. So like, these are my hard limits, these are my kinks. Sort of these are the activities in BDSM that I am looking to do, that I enjoy doing, as opposed to my hard limits or the things that I'm not super enthusiastic about. So someone might say my main kinks are pet play, DDLG, and rope bondage. And that wouldn't necessarily mean that those things are sexually arousing to them or that they're fetishes, but it merely means that this is a type of BDSM activity that they enjoy doing. All of this being said, though, this is very much, once again, open to personal interpretation, especially with the term kink. You may decide that, like, everything in BDSM is a kink, even if it's not your kink, for example, which is also how some people use the term kink, is like shorthand for any type of BDSM activity. You might decide that kink is a term you only use for things that are sexually arousing for you. You might decide that you only use the term kinks for things that aren't sexually arousing. What's important is you find out how you want to use the term kink, and then you communicate that to other people. I think sort of the downfall of having this be something that is used so interchangeably in so many different ways is we don't stop to like talk to our partners how we think about certain definitions. And so what that means is we can have entire negotiations, we can talk about entire scenes we want to do, entire relationships we want to set up. And if we have very different ways of defining what a fetish means to us, of what a kink means to us, and we never set that up ahead of time, then we could be describing completely different things that we want to have done in our relationships, in our scenes. So I would always recommend that you do check in with people when you are having those conversations. Just say, hey, when you say this is a kink for you, can you describe what that means? Or proactively be like, hey, this is a kink for me. When I say kink, that's what I mean by this term. And I think that would be really helpful for a lot of people if we can get into the habit of doing that, even if what I have presented here, I think, would be definitions that most people in the community would agree with. There are always going to be those edge cases. And I hope that what I've done here today is maybe not so much give you a monolith of exactly what these terms mean, but offer an opportunity for you to have some introspection about how you relate to these terms. And before we end this video, I do want to to end on just a quick little side note, because this is a question that I got really frequently on the last video I did talking about kinks and fetishes, and that would be, can you get over a fetish? Now, if you are looking at the development of fetishes from kind of a classical conditioning perspective, where maybe it starts out with sort of an initial interest and you fantasize about that thing and you really focus on it, that creates an association in your brain where that thing is linked to pleasure, so you think about it more, and then that just kind of snowballs to the point where you need that thing in order to become aroused because it is so linked in your brain to becoming aroused. So if you can condition yourself into making that association, the theory goes you can then decondition yourself. However, I am not a mental health professional. I am not a psychologist. I'm not a social worker. I am not anyone who is remotely qualified in any way to talk you through actually going about that process. So if you are dealing with maybe negative feelings about a fetish that you have, if you want to work through it, if you potentially don't want to have it be part of your sexual response cycle anymore, please go to a professional. Please go to someone who can actually, guide you through this whole process one-on-one, because I'm not going to be able to do that. But I do want to say that it is possible and it does happen for people. I also know people who have just sort of inadvertently lost a fetish, how you lose socks in the dryer, people just lose fetishes sometimes. I used to be really into feet, not literally me, but theoretical me. I used to be really into feet, and then suddenly one day I woke up and then it just wasn't that important to me anymore. And that can just happen sometimes. I mean, I think that we consider ourselves completely developed in that way by the time we're maybe early 30s, but our brain is still always going through changes. And when we have different experiences, things that used to be really important to us in a fetish way may be replaced by other things that may sort of lose their importance. So things kind of, ebb and flow. Life goes on, things change. So it may not be something where you are eternally bound to this fetish forever if you don't want that to be the case. But fetishes, again, don't have to be a negative thing. They can be a healthy, normal part of someone's sexual life as long as they are doing it in a way that's not causing them undue distress or non-consensual harm to others. Blah, 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 everything I mentioned beforehand. Anyways, that is everything I wanted to cover in today's video. Hopefully this answered some of your questions about the differences between fetishes and kinks. If you don't remember anything else from this video, I think it would be this. Fetishes are inherently linked to our sexual response cycle. Kinks are not necessarily so, and they refer to a wider range of activities. So yeah, just hold on to that little nugget right there, and I think that will be very helpful for you when you are going through the world of BDSM and trying to figure these things out. If you enjoyed this video, if this helped you in any way, please let me know by subscribing. That is so helpful for me. And also, if you want to support my channel, the best way you can do that is actually through Patreon. A link to that will be down below. That's what makes this video possible. As well, it allows me an opportunity to give you guys access to things that I can't talk about on YouTube, with bonus videos, a Discord chat, FetLife access, etc. So if that interests you, please go down to the description box below and check that out. If you already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.